This podcast is part of the Deluxe Edition Network. To find other great shows on the network, head over to deluxeeditionnetwork.com. That's deluxeeditionnetwork.com.
The year is 1985, and director Wolfgang Petersen decides to traumatize us once more after his claustrophobic war drama Das Boot and his dark-as-hell children's fantasy film The Never-Ending Story. This time, he takes us to the far reaches of space in this sci-fi rendition of Robinson Crusoe, where a stranded space pilot and his mortal enemy must learn to put aside their differences and rely on each other for survival in an isolated world surrounded by predatory space worms and cataclysmic meteor showers. While the two learn to appreciate the beauty of each other's cultures, the world around them only gets darker and more dangerous in the sci-fi classic Enemy Mine. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony. Okay, 1985. I saw this in the theater with my dad, and just like Never-Ending Story, there is like this fantastical flair to this outer space science fiction movie where we almost forget it's science fiction to a point. Like once they are on the planet and they are just surviving together, it really does feel more like a fantastical drama where we're not really thinking of Jerry as an alien anymore. We're thinking of him as just another character, just another species. And of course, we're going to get into like the racial allegories of this, of like, you know, the metaphor of harmony amongst the people and appreciating and accepting each other's differences. But our critics disagreed on this one heavily. One of them thought it was an amazing film. The other one thought it was just run-of-the-mill, standard, straight out of Amazing Stories, science fiction nonsense. And we'll get to that in the second half of the episode. But since this was my episode and this was my movie to pick, it is my turn to ask you, Justin, how do you feel about Enemy Mine?
This one, I am glad this appeared because I haven't seen this in years. And I remember seeing this as a kid, and truth be told, this is one of those rare handful of movies that did scare me as a kid, next to Little Monsters and Never-Ending Story. But there was an appreciation that I had for it going into my teenage years and so on and so forth. I love this movie. I love everything about it when it comes to the messaging, when it comes to the characters, when it comes to almost an origin story of the on-screen likability of Dennis Quaid. So there is so much to this movie that if you see this as a teenager to really appreciate some of the foundational excellence that this presents, it is a gem that's a shame that's not readily available for more to see, especially in current times today. That makes it even more relevant than it did in the 80s.
Yeah, like as far as I know, because I've been watching this movie every couple years for a while now, it doesn't stream on any of the regular apps. So it's not very easy for people just to walk in and find it like so many other films that we've covered. You can rent this, it's available, but it's not just there for the pickings. And when it comes to physical media, the DVDs versions of it are expensive, and there is a Blu-ray from out of the country that is really expensive. It's just one of those films that, like, I think there were so many European backers to it that it's hard to get the licensing right. So it is available in other regions, but it's hard to get here in physical media. But when I was growing up, this was on TNT or TBS all the time. You know, so you would have Beastmaster all the time and Last Starfighter, and this fit heavily into that rotation. And so I did see this movie many, many times as a child after the theatrical experience, and it's almost like a perennial favorite. I do watch this like every couple years. Now, none of my friends or family really like this movie as much as I do, so it's usually a solo watch, which is fine. And there is something a little bit nostalgic and retro about the special effects, all practical. The spaceships look a little dated. I mean, this movie is what, 7, 8 years after Star Wars, but it makes it look like it was made a decade before. But there's something charming to that. There's a charm to this movie. When I say the fantastical aspect, that's what I'm talking about. And I gotta say, so when we put our list together, I was way ahead of you on the films that I had in my slots, and you've been plugging your films in a little bit at a time, like 2 or 3 at a time. So I had already had this film on the list before you put Great Balls of Fire on, but we covered Great Balls of Fire first. It's amazing to me how much I can't stand Dennis Quaid in that film and how much I absolutely love his performance in this one. He's just one of those actors, man, where it's like I either hate everything he's doing or I love everything he's doing. There really is no in between. So like Dragonheart, Great Balls of Fire, I cannot stand him in. But this film and Flesh and Bone and The Big Easy, like those are movies that he's great in. So I think he's a very, very talented guy. I think the project is what determines how much I enjoy what he's doing. And I'm going to say right here and now, this is my favorite Dennis Quaid performance and film, hands down.
That one would be up for debate, and I think we should have that in another episode. Um, but this one is a special role for him, and Dennis Quaid, he is at his best when he has a role that's made for him, and you can absolutely tell when a role is designed to his kind of likability on screen and when it's not. This is one that is one of his
Right.
earlier films, and you can tell right from the get-go, and I wish they would have gone into detail on both their reviews with Siskel and Ebert. There's a shot where he just kinda looks at the screen and gives that Dennis Quaid smile, and it is a pivotal shot that says, "This guy is gonna be a star. He's gonna be one of those characters in future movies that's gonna be likable." And it's one of those that I had to rewind a couple times to just take in. But yeah, you're absolutely right when it comes to the absolute summary of Dennis Quaid. It's a hit or miss. A lot of his current stuff is absolutely atrocious to watch, but in the '80s, this is where he's really starting to come into a shell to find out what kind of character he is, and then in the '90s, that's when we get a lot of that Dennis Quaid that's a real hit or miss. But this one, he it's not just a Dennis Quaid picture, it's a picture around chemistry. And Gossett and Quaid are a perfect match. Even with the aesthetics and the special effects, it takes the body language and the dialogue to make these two really intertwine, and it just works.
That's one of the things, too, when we get into the review of Siskel and Ebert about this film. I've heard it said many times about many actors that get behind the makeup and they're like, oh, well, it's just the makeup that's doing the performance. I disagree. Uh, this film, Louis Gossett's performance behind the makeup to me is an enhancer of the performance. Like the performance helps us believe that this is a real creature, a real alien. There are other films that do this. I think Daniel Herlihy as Grigg in Last Starfighter is one of those where the performance emits through the makeup. And I'm not talking about like Jim Carrey stuff where like it doesn't matter what face is on top of his regular face, he's going to perform. I'm talking about real emotions. I'm talking about getting someone to care about you. I even think that Peter Weller in RoboCop could be put on that list where it's like you do have the empathy and the sympathy towards its character, even though he's stoic in a machine, the humanity still bleeds through the costume, bleeds through the mask. And this one, 100%, it might be like the best makeup performance where you're not seeing an actor's face. And that can be challenging for an actor. Like there's a lot of actors that have ego. It's like, I don't want my face hidden. I don't want people to like not know it's me. Well, what better way to convince an audience that you're a fantastic actor than to get them so invested in your role and your story and your persona, and the whole time you've got a crazy rubber alien mask on? I think that is like a true high watermark of performance.
You see the most successful actors and actresses utilize and perfect this that have done theater, that have to amplify their facial expressions, that have to amplify their performance, because they have to ensure that the entire audience can take in the emotion that you're presenting. And it is an additional skill, and you're 100% right. They don't get enough credit, especially today where it's all CGI, it's all uh, special effects that give the emotion. Absolutely not. We give too much credit to these practical effects and CGI effects. This is true facial expression talent that really these talents have to amplify to really ensure that they portray their emotion through it. And it's harder, in my opinion, when you have so much layers of makeup and latex on your face to really project your emotions. So it is a very skilled talent, especially when it comes to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, to get that through all those layers. And Gossett, I was utterly impressed rewatching it to see how specific he is when it comes to not only his facial expressions, but how he utilizes his entire body to get that emotion out. So this to me, it's a best Quaid performance for you. To me, this is a new level of Gossett Jr. that really stays with me. And I'd love to give credit because these performers really don't get the credit that they deserve when it comes to the characters they play when you really can't see their faces. And they're the ones doing all the heavy lifting, not the special effects.
And we're talking about this to this very day too, because Andy Serkis, he created essentially a whole new way to perform where the motion capture CGI, yeah, it's really easy to say like, oh, it's just, they can do it with computers. When you watch those side by side frames of him with all the dots on his face and then the character he's portraying right next to it, you're seeing that, oh no, you're seeing real emotions from this person, that you are really believing he's a character. He's believing he's a character. He is King Kong. He is Caesar. He is Gollum. Like, that is, to me, the new example of what we're talking about. The earliest examples, let's say Lon Chaney Sr., right? Or Charles Laughton through all that makeup back in the silent era and the golden age of cinema. And then we have stuff like this. And I would also say Doug Jones, too, who does the Guillermo del Toro movies. He's been doing it for years behind big rubber masks and crazy makeup, but you still see and feel the emotions emitting through them. So yeah, it's I'm not going to say it's a lost art. It's definitely an underappreciated art. What makes me even more impressed with Gossett, though, is this was not his realm, right? He was used to playing like tough guys. Everyone knows him as the drill sergeant and officer and gentleman. He got his Oscar for it. I think it's funny that just 2 years before this film, he and Dennis Quaid were in Jaws 3 together. So they already kind of had a relationship that way. Like, well, maybe this one will be better. It had some production stuff we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, like he was not a guy who was trained or crafted this skill of performing under all this heavy makeup like Doug Jones is, or like Andy Serkis is with the motion capture, which again makes it even that much more impressive. And like you said, his physical performance, it's almost avian, where he has like a lot of bird-like reflexes and movements. And then just the things that he does with his voice, that gurgle, which it's almost as, to me, iconic as like the Predator rattle, right? Like when he rolls his R's, but he's doing it with the back of his throat. It sounds so alien. It just makes that character more convincible, which infuriates me later on when we talk about the critiques of this film. But yeah, it makes me wonder, like, could that performance be as respectable if he didn't have Quaid, if he had a different actor opposite him? Like you said, the chemistry, it's so right. I feel that if there are moments where Louis Gossett is maybe too heavy-handed with the performance, Dennis Quaid brings it down, and vice versa. If Dennis Quaid is a little maybe too underplayed or a little too stoic, Gossett brings more energy out of him, especially in the scenes where like they're fighting with each other at the beginning and they're making fun of like the philosopher and Mickey Mouse. They're just doing their best to try and find ways to assault each other with what little they know about each other's cultures. That probably doesn't read well on the page, right? It probably doesn't read the way it would feel it should be performed, but the way they do it, it's as natural as anything, which brings so much credibility to this mid 80s sci-fi fare.
Well, not only that, but let's look at the design of Gossett's character. This can be easily taken into almost a scary, terrifying. And I said I was scared of this movie, but I was scared of the seclusion and the situation, not necessarily Gossett, because this you have to be careful on the performance, not to go overboard with the overall heavy-handed alien motif. You have to
Right.
really balance the human nature to it, and I think when it comes to them balancing each other, like you said, it is a give and take kind of chemistry. And Gossett really never goes overboard with this. It's really a subtle performance, but a powerful one when it comes to how he's portraying this creature.
Production value too, and the design is very immersive. And to give quick little history, this film started off with a different director and a different location. So they'd already spent $17 million with director Richard Longcrane, and he was shooting it in Iceland. And according to the things I read, the dailies never matched because the weather was always changing. It just looked too much like planet Earth. And for all that money, the executives didn't think that they were getting their sci-fi feel for what they were spending. So they fired him and essentially shot the whole movie over again with Wolfgang Peterson. And he had just barely come off of Never Ending Story. In fact, he was still like doing bits and pieces of Never Ending Story reshoots when he started production on this. And he used a lot of, not the same sets, but pieces of those sets. So that's why I think that there is a very similar feel in the fantastical world of this planet, where it does kind of feel like Fantasia once Fantasia goes dark. The pond in the Swamp of Sadness is the same pond that they used to shoot the first introduction to Jerry, where his spaceship is by the big body of water that he sets on fire. So there's a familiarity to it, and the fantastical presence of these set pieces, to me, is what makes it feel almost like a 50s cornball sci-fi, but with modern day consequences and modern day danger and suspense. Like, we definitely feel the isolation and the danger of the environment because, as they learn quickly, they are not as much a danger to each other as the world around them is. And so they have a better chance of survival against space worms and cataclysmic meteor showers and sudden changes in weather and earthquakes. Like, that is where the real suspense and the real drama comes in, is like, okay, we can still hate each other, but we kind of need each other to survive. And that is really the first two acts of the movie. And for two people on screen, I never once felt bored. I never once felt like it was running long or dry. The pacing is just so good. It does get a little rushed at the end, but again, are you going to hold that against everything else that just preceded it? I don't.
Well, and here's the thing about Wolfgang Peterson is he treats his setting like it's an actual character. If we look at Das Boot, even Air Force One, The Perfect Storm, these settings are engulfing. They're there to support the characters. The setting almost reacts to the characters' reactions. So I appreciate Peterson on his attention to detail when it comes to where his talents act, because you
Right.
have to create that environment to build almost a stake to what these two have to survive against. And we see that in progression to a lot of the characters in the movies he directs because the settings are always spot on. There's a certain danger element to everything that he does, even when he gets into some generic action movies in the early 2090s, whatever it may be. But Peterson is very smart when it comes to setting that foundation to his cast to really engulf everybody from viewer to cast member into this world. And to me, the environment isn't a standout, it's a support. It's eye pleasing. And this is what drives me nuts about movies of the 80s is you have a lot of these sci-fi movies that came out, especially post Star Wars, Return of the Jedi, where they really wanted to be the next. They really wanted audience to say, "Show me something I haven't seen." And Peterson doesn't necessarily do that to an extreme level. He does it subtly, but in very impressively. But it never outshines the performances. It's never just eye candy just to be eye candy. It's there for a rhyme and reason to higher the stakes for the talent. And that's what makes Peterson to me a extremely intelligent director during that time.
Oh, I agree. There is a sentimentality to this film that I think is very unexpected to people on their first time view who don't know what this movie is, where we almost get the emotional scars from what happens the way we would in, let's say, a love story film, right? Or a film about family and loss. There is such a connection between these two that when the stakes get raised and disaster happens, this is a movie that its audience was probably kids and then men, sci-fi guys and stuff like that. I don't really think they meant this for families. If they did, they definitely were trying to appease all the different tastes of the family because there's lots of gore in this movie. There's a lot of horror. There's a lot of violence. But then the sentimental and emotional moments are just so heart-wrenching. And then we get introduced to a third character halfway through the second act where Jerry is an asexual creature that just self-reproduces, and he has a child, little Zammies. And Zammies now has to rely on Dennis Quaid to raise him. And he's essentially his father, but he calls him uncle. But the fact that Dennis Quaid's character Davidge has learned all of the lore and all of the religious, rituals and rites that he needs to pass on to Zammies if they ever get off this planet, that dedication to that and his just utter dedication to the well-being, education, and survival of this child, well, it's just a whole nother realm of emotion now where we've, stepped aside from the best friend and survival story, and now it turns into 20, 30 minutes of a father-son story.
100%, because we have that pivotal scene where they're reciting the Testament, and there's similarities to it, and that's where the relatability is. And Jerry's whole mantra is love. The Testament's about love, just like ours is. And he says, truth is truth. And when we get that birth of a child, all other things are aside. That's when human instinct, that's when just the survival instinct comes in. And we go back to not only the religion that we practice across the board of love, we practice another's because that's the relatable piece between all species, all races. No matter what it is, we have that sentiment to take care of those that are living, whether even through an animal basis. We see a herd animal, we have sympathy for that. And that's where the human element comes in to really going on parental instincts to take care of this child. It's not necessarily a relationship with Jerry per se, and that's up for debate. There's a part of it, but I think it's more of the messaging of this is what we've learned from each other when it comes to our two species, our two races, is to take care of the living. This is a child. That's the one thing that can unite everybody is a child is innocent, and that's where the seed of understanding comes in, is to really grow this character. And we do see a development from the Quaid character when it comes to how he progresses along with this child, which I think is a beautiful sentiment and a beautiful moment in this.
Right, because it's not even his child. It's not even his species. So when we get to that third act where the real kind of social morality metaphors come in, where now we have humans trashing this planet, mining it for its precious metals and ores, and they have captured these Dracs, this species, and they're using them as slave labor. And, yes, it's going to have your historical allegories to, the slave trade and things like that. And it does feel heavy-handed a little bit, and they do mention that in the critique, but it doesn't feel like forced to me. It is what it is, and it does raise the stakes for Zammies and for Davidge. But one of the things that I really think makes it work is that we don't spend too much time there, right? We see just enough of what they're doing and the cruelty and the things that these Dracs have to go through because at the beginning of the movie, it feels like they're the more dominant species, that they're the ones that are probably more aggressive. And then you see them in this situation and you realize, well, outside of their technology, they're not as aggressive as humans are. And we've seen that before. I mean, it's essentially Avatar, you know? But the thing that I think really adds to the danger of it is they bring in one of my favorite character actors of the 80s, and that's Brian James from Southern Comfort and Blade Runner and Tango and Cash and so many other movies. He essentially plays like the foreman, the head guy of this slave trade, of this mining operation. And just his presence and his performance alone even adds to the higher stakes of danger because he is a guy that is not afraid to kill anyone or anything to keep his operation going, to keep the things moving, and to keep the ore flowing. And it's a small role, but it's a memorable one, just like most of his roles are. So to me, that is kind of like the gimme of that guy. Let's put a treacherous character into this movie, is going to disrupt the sentimentality that we've been experiencing and put the real danger in. And I just love it. I think it's a rushed third act, but it does enough things right for me to forgive the rush.
Well, here's the deal, and I'm sure we're gonna get into a deeper conversation when we get to the critics because that's a bigger conversation. But when it comes to the messaging and we hear we're going into the cliche, we've seen it all before. I don't care because here's the deal. When it comes to the messaging of it, you're going to see messaging like this in numerous movies and hundreds of movies. It's what leads up to it. Does it earn that cliche moment? Does it feel right? Is it placed in to really execute the message? And here, even though you're right, it does feel rushed, but I think there was so much context and so much substance leading up to it that it earned the right to speed it up a little bit. Does it damage the messaging? In my opinion, absolutely not. Because when it comes to it, there is a little bit of a thrill to it. There are stakes to it, and we get hints of what's to come. And when there's a child in danger, that is a stakes. I don't care. The messaging is there to earn Quaid's character the right to rescue this child. The messaging can't suffer, and it doesn't. And I think that's what the movie does really well. Is I don't feel I lost anything during that final act to really ruin this movie because it earned every moment of its cliche moment.
It does, 100%. And it also kind of gives us that like bright side hope of humanity where, yes, we got the evil miners that are out there making slaves of the Dracs. But then we also have essentially the military that kind of break off to go rescue Davidge and they team up with the Dracs. So it shows that there is a future, that there is a chance of a peaceful and cohesive existence between these two warring species. May it happen right away? Maybe not, but this could be the catalyst of the reconstruction of this, galactic alliance between these two races. Like, okay, we've just seen that humans aren't so bad. They just rescued all these Dracs from this operation. And even though the bad guys are human, well, we're not going to hold that against the humans. There's just bad guys. There's probably bad Dracs, that's one of the things that I think I would have liked to seen a little bit more about that culture is we just see the side of it that's very theological, right? We see that group of Dracs, we see Jerry's religious beliefs or his quest for truth, the philosophical nature of it. But it almost makes you wonder, like, okay, well, so are there other races of Dracs that are, let's say, more warmongering, or are they just complacent? They're like the conscientious objectors of this war. But they do mention in the dialogue that the humans were the ones that invaded and attacked first. So that is kind of on us. I don't think it's very important to the story, but on rewatches, like I do so much, it does give me a little bit more of the insight of to why the Dracs hate the humans so much. We essentially went in there and started shooting is what we did.
They give all this information, and it's almost up for viewers to kind of read between the lines to an extent. And like we take movies like this with sci-fi, we can almost compare it to sports movies where we know the outcome, we know the subject matter. It's just a matter of you ask yourself three questions. Did it entertain? Did it make you think? Or did it change you? This one falls into almost a borderline of It made you think just like a normal sports movie that you know the outcome.
Oh, we'll definitely get into that once we start playing these clips of their critiques.
Roger reviews a wild new science fiction film called Enemy Mine.
I think wild was your word, not mine, especially if you meant it as praise. Enemy Mine takes place 100 years in the future when human beings are fighting for control of the galaxy against the reptilian race named the Dracs. This is right out of Captain Video. As an Earth warrior, played by Dennis Quaid, is shot down on an alien planet, and so is his adversary, a Drac who is played in effectively scaly makeup by Gossett Jr. A lot of the movie might remind you of Robinson Crusoe, and this scene is an example as the human tries to teach the Drac to speak English.
That is your ugly head.
No. This is my head. That is you head. You ugly head.
Okay, so he definitely picked the wrong clip if he was trying to make a point of how empty and hollow this movie and these performances are, because that scene right there is the one that really gets you liking these two people together. I have such frustration with Roger sometimes when he completely contradicts everything he said in other episodes. He praises the hero's journey aspect of so many films, and this essentially is a hero's journey film. It follows a hero's journey plot line, and yet he's saying that he's tired of seeing stuff like this, that this is just another run-of-the-mill. It may as well be Captain Video. It may as well be some like 1950s hodgepodge sci-fi. I don't understand why he does that, why he contradicts himself on the point of ridiculousness when he praises so many other films that follow the exact same formula. What do you think it is about this movie?
I think Roger felt the same way that a lot of audiences felt about sci-fi movies in 85. They were worn out and he was sick of it because we had 1984 jam-packed, like I said, trying to be the next Star Wars. You had Dune, you had Last Starfighter, Starman, Search for Spock, 2010, whatever it may be. 85 had a bunch of sci-fi junk, a lot of midnight movie kind of stuff, nothing that stood out. This would be the one that stood out. And I think just like Roger, audiences were exhausted with sci-fi, which led to kind of the box office failure of this. And I think this is where he's finding a reason not to like it because his written review wasn't as bad as what he's presenting. And we'll get into that in a second. But he is just setting the seed to nitpick. And I think this is the start of the crescendo of where he's going to go, where Gene just kind of pokes at him and pisses him off.
And he does.
Mind never rises to its own challenge. It creates those interesting characters on that alien world and then plugs them into a plot straight out of any old soap opera, right down to the scene where some humans use Dracs as slaves in their minds, which of course leads to yet another phony assembly line climax with fistfights and guns and explosions. Can't Hollywood think of any way to end an action picture except with a shootout? How about thinking through the implications of this contact between two races?
So, again, he goes back to the whole cliche thing. It goes out of sci-fi now, and now he's attacking the action genre. Why does every film have to end with a shootout? It really doesn't. I think there's only like 2 shots fired in this entire ending. You know, one from Brian James and then one from a character that takes Brian James out. That's not a shootout. The killer or hard boiled, that's a shootout. I don't know what he's talking about with the shootout thing. In fact, there's actually more physical violence between Brian James and Dennis Quaid on that conveyor belt where Sammy's is in one of those mineral bins and he's about to get dumped into some hot ore. Like the stakes are so high in that and the tension is so high. And we've already seen in a film like this that they're not afraid to kill a main character. That just makes the stakes even higher, where we don't know where the movie is going to go. So the fact that he says it's so run-of-the-mill, even when I rewatch this, I still have the tension of like, I know what's going to happen, but I feel the tension of what could happen.
Yeah, I felt the tension too, because right when he sneaks on, there is an extra level of tension if he's going to get caught. How is he going to get in there with all these people around? And it has a super cool kill scene where a guy gets demolished in one of these conveyor things and losing an ear.
It's pretty cool.
So there's more hand-to-hand combat than anything. But I think what he is struggling to articulate is that he just didn't like the rescue me climax that we have seen over and over before, but not like this. So, I mean, as I talked about before, we have a lot of those generic sci-fi movies that came out, and yes, I will agree to an extent that we do see a lot of that similarities, but those were shootouts. This was not. This was an exact rescue mission, and I think it matches the character perfectly well, where he doesn't go for the gun. He's just there to not really harm as an intent, but just to save a child. And we see that when he interacts with the Drac.
That's the whole point. He is just there to save a child. In fact, I'm not even sure if he was even going to like attempt to save the other Dracs from slavery. His whole point was the child. I totally got that. I think it is debatable depending on like how you watch the movie. Is like, oh, he's there to liberate. My opinion is like liberation's the last thing on his mind. He just wants that child. And it's actually the other group of humans that help liberate even more. I mean, essentially the Dracs are liberating themselves once they see an opportunity. But yeah, and it's not, I'll tell you what's stereotypical for me. Stereotypical is the Ewoks showing up and saving the day with their primitive tools, or the desert tribe in Stargate coming over the hill with their crazy camels. Like, that to me is stereotypical. We've seen that 1,000 times where the primitive tribe runs over the hill and saves the day, right? This isn't that. This is almost like Liam Neeson in Taken. He doesn't care. He's just going to get that child, and he's got a special set of skills.
100%. And we do get a little hint of that towards the end with the Dracs, but you know what? I don't care. It's okay with that because it's a feel-good moment, because at the end, it is there to intent to make you feel good, to give a message and deliver a message that will sit well with audiences, whether it was intended to be a family movie or not. The messaging at the end shows that it's there for a feel-good moment, and I think that was directed to kids, in my opinion. But I think he totally got that right.
So now it goes into one of the most heated debates I've seen in a long time. And we said that in the last Bad Influence episode where, wow, they really debated over this. This one is 1 minute and 40 seconds of debate. And for their 4 or 5 minute reviews of things, that's a lot. So Gene just jumps right in and he's like, what are you talking about?
First of all, I think, to use your phrase, you really missed the boat this time. I think this is a wonderful picture for all of the reasons that you cited. You like the performances, you like the look of the planet, and now let me add the other things that I like. The ending is, and I don't want to give it away, but there is a birth scene that is spectacular, and a creature is created that's a delight, and I think kids will love that film. The film also does deal a lot with racial harmony, not in a heavy-handed way, I don't think. The humor of the film is very funny. Those two guys are very funny, exchanging insults. And the wild creatures, that thing coming out of the sand. Remember how much we hated Dune with its worms? This has the kind of worms that Dune should have. There isn't a thing that I don't like about this movie. That's how much I like it.
Okay, well, I like the worm. One of the things that I could...
You like a lot of things about this
One of the things I would like to ask you about this movie is how come they couldn't give us an alien that's alien? Why give us an alien that is obviously Luke Gossett in makeup,
I didn't know that.
speaking English immediately?
Did not know that.
Isn't that amazing? Why doesn't the human learn to speak a little more Drac? Because people at home don't want to listen to Drac coming from the screen.
You're wrong.
He learns a little Drac, and the other guy learns a lot of English and turns into a very... And then the kid, the little baby Drac, turns into just a little baby little leaguer. That was really tremendous.
But you know why? Because his father is a white human, and so he's learning from the father. So that's absolutely logical.
His father is a white human? The father of the Drac?
That he thinks, as he calls him uncle. Now, we've given away too much of the plot. It's still a great movie. Coming up next at the movie. Coming up next at the movie. You stay out of this.
You stay out of this. That was heated. And I'm sorry, Roger does not have enough to back up his claims at all. Gene is 100% right on this one. He's right about the racial harmony aspect. He's right about the birth scene, which is a magical scene. And what the hell is Roger's point he's trying to make about, I wanted a more alien? Like, he wanted the xenomorph from Alien to be the secondary character? It totally dissolves the fact that Willis Gossett Jr. just gave an amazing performance, did crazy things with his voice and his throat and all of his movements. He's an alien through and through. He's not just a guy in the suit. So I thought that was so insulting to the performance. And again, I think it's just such a hollow and empty negative critique of this film where just say you don't like the movie. Don't start trying to like point the reasons out why we shouldn't like it, because the reasons you're giving us are actually the reasons why we like it. And that's the part that like really, really frustrated me with that review.
Well, he gave Gene the worms. He liked the worms. But this is the thing. This is where Roger let emotion get a hold of him, because he
Yeah.
did not hate this movie. He gave it 2.5 stars. So, I mean, he wasn't too far off. But the points Gene was making, and don't think I agree with Gene as much on any of the other episodes we've done other than this one. I think he's really
Yeah.
spot on. But here's the funny thing about Roger's critique, and I didn't watch this episode before a rewatch, so I wanted to rewatch beforehand. And in my notes, I put um, the same thing that Roger did, is the scene when they learn languages. Is I will agree to an extent with Roger on that. Is why didn't we have more of an elaborate scene of learning both languages and then it goes to English? I put that in my notes, but then this is where I really think that it was meant for more of a family affair. Is audiences wouldn't eat that up. If we subtitled it, that would be harder for everybody to read. So I think yes and no to that aspect of Roger's review, but everything else Roger is pointing out is completely out of emotion and it's inaccurate. He wanted this alien to be something different. He wanted this alien in the environment to not breathe the same air, not eat the same foods, not have the same uh, atmospheric reactions that humans do. So I can see that to an extent, but I think he is being overly critiqued. Or he's being overly analytical of this movie when it comes to what it's trying to do, because he wants the full spread. He wants a message, he wants a theme, and he wants a sci-fi movie, and he wants great performances. He wants the perfect movie out of this specific movie, and that's not what it's sought out to do. It's there to take a message and deliver it, and that's what it did in a sci-fi se- scene. So I think for what it does a very fantastic job.
Well, he's also wrong about that point of debate he's trying to make about why isn't he learning more Drac. It's in the dialogue. We get a slow montage with music, no dialogue over it, but he has to learn 5,000 generations of history to pass on to Zammies. So not only does he know the language, he had to learn the names of 5,000 of Jerry's ancestors to pass on to Zammies so Zammies can present it to the council when he gets to his home planet, which is how the movie ends. So he does do the due diligence. He does learn the language. And Gene is 100% right. He's like, yeah, I don't think people are going to want to sit and just watch him recite Drac history for 5-10 minutes, even if it is subtitled. No, they're going to save that precious dialogue for the jokes, for the humor, and for the things that make us want to spend more time with these two characters. Because, I mean, it's a blessing and a curse. Jerry's screen time is painfully short. Like, his character doesn't exist in the movie as much as the trailer, the poster, or the first premise of the movie is. Like, Jerry goes away a lot faster than you think when you rewatch this movie, because there is almost an entire second act with just him and Zammies before the humans show up. So it's precious. The screen time they share is precious, and they're not going to waste it on useless Dracian drivel that Roger's complaining about the film not having. He's like, okay, well, you're a screenwriter, Roger. You've written movies. You should know that. You got to keep the audience's attention. You used boobs in Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. You know, they're using humor and sarcasm between two species that don't know anything about each other. And that is what's keeping our attention.
So if they would have put boobs in Drac's language, I'm sure Roger would have appreciated that. So I can see that. So yeah, I'll agree to that extent. To me, I agree and disagree. That's the one big question mark for me on this one, and it doesn't ruin the movie. And it's not a make or break as Roger's making it to sound. For me, I would have loved to see an example. To your point of that being used towards the end of the movie, or finding it useful in this sort of context when it comes down to it. Something more than just that montage of learning the language. I would like to see more, but again, that is me really just cherry picking and just nitpicking at things that would have slightly improved this movie, but not a deal breaker. So, I mean, for me, it's hard to pick out things and criticize something of a movie that I really enjoy so much. But if I were to pick it, it would be very little things like this, not enough to put that much emotion into an argument about that we see Roger does. Because at the end of the day, this movie does exactly what it's supposed to do, and is it is absolutely entertaining while it's doing it. So and it's a shame that this was, again, a flop at the box office, and I think that really teetered into a lot of people's decisions when it comes to renting this movie or seeing it down the road. So, it's reviews like this that really give that passion of criticism that really makes it a shame that it can influence movies like this to a point where it just gets overlooked.
And that is why before we recorded, I kind of just threw it out there on social media and some of the Discord channels of like, hey, we're recording an episode on Enemy Mine tonight. 80s babies. Do you remember this film? And what are your thoughts about it? And there wasn't a single person that said they didn't like this movie. There were some that didn't know what it was. One guy thought it was Stargate, okay. But I don't know anyone that doesn't like this movie. Like my generation, if it was on cable, you saw it. Maybe you didn't see all of it. Maybe you just saw parts of it. That happened to us, where we couldn't just TiVo something. If we turned it on and it was halfway through it, hey, we just watched half the movie. That's kind of how it works sometimes. But it is a cult favorite. It is a sci-fi cult favorite, and it's highly collectible. I think that this is a film that I'm not saying it should be remade. It could be very easily be remade. It could even be like a series. I don't know. They're doing so many different things with media these days. But it's not one of those movies that people consider trash and should be ignored. Like when people find it, or when people discover it, or when people remember it, it is always on the higher end of appreciation, and deservedly so. Leonard Maltin loved this movie. Siskel loved this movie, right? Like a lot of critics liked this movie. More critics liked this film than critics didn't when I went back and looked at those reviews. And it's a shame too, because we talk about that every episode where it's like, I can't believe this was a flop. Yet there are these reviews and these critics who are like, oh, go see this movie, and then people don't. It makes me really question like the brevity of the art of critique, at least when it was on TV or in mass publication newspapers, of how much did it really affect the box office, right? Like how much did it really affect the bottom line, where if you had critics that loved the movie but audiences just didn't buy into it, is it a timing thing? Is it a seasonal thing? Like that's why filmmaking to me is such a gamble, especially on the Hollywood level, where it could just be the wrong month, and they still haven't figured that shit out yet. We're making movies for over 100 years now, and they still think they know the formula for success. Spend more money. You got to spend money to make money. Oh, make sure it goes out during the summertime or during the holidays. Don't release it in January, that kind of stuff. But we never, never, never see it work 100% of the time. It's always still just a crapshoot.
This is one of those perfect sci-fi movies that has all the elements. You have the scene, you have the aliens, it has the talk of unity, different species. This should have been the 1985 perfect sci-fi movie, but it was everything that you mentioned, all of the above, because this came out at the end of the year, Christmas week, when you had an entire year of absolute sci-fi junk. So you have
Yeah.
that planting the seed, you have Christmas time. It was a recipe for disaster. This was a prime example of Hollywood self-destructing a genre during that year. So to me, I think it wasn't necessarily just a critique. I think that helped just alley-oop it into the flop, but I think it was everything that set in place that entire year. This was poor timing. If this would have come out in a normal month for a sci-fi feature, pre-June, I think this would have actually done pretty well. I think if this would have been before all the junk that we saw in '85, I think this would have actually had another story to tell. And to me, that would be a shame. But I really do hope that people go see this movie now because I do think that this deserves a watch based on the messaging, the themes with current times. You can tie this in. It's a universal message. And you can tell that the audience, it's successful with the audiences now that see it because it has heart. When a movie has heart, that's when you're going to get that strong audience reaction when it comes to talking about a movie. So I would be very shocked of talking to somebody that sees this movie that says, I didn't like it because I didn't feel anything. I didn't feel any heart from this movie because that's the one thing that it really has going for it. And that's thanks again to the performances.
This came out the same week as The Color Purple and Out of Africa. Both were Oscar contenders. One was an Oscar winner. So it's really hard for a film like this to go up against such prestige cinema, especially when the critics both agreed how great these movies were. So we've done this before where it's like, okay, this movie just came out in a bad week. It came out against Oscar contenders. It came out against a Spielberg movie who hadn't made a movie in like 4 or 5 years at the time, right? So I get it. I get probably where the world and where the theatrical going audiences were in their mind space. Like, oh, we're going to go see the new Steven Spielberg movie. I don't want to see the alien and other guy on the planet movie. Like, I get it. You're 100% right. It's all about timing. So when it comes down to the scores of our critics, so for my critic, Mr. Gene Siskel, I love how much he defends this movie. I love how much he likes this movie. I'm going to give him a solid B and not an A because he really was talking about how much he liked the movie in the aspects that are very visible and understandable. He doesn't really get much into the nuance like he does in other episodes. He just really is kind of defending why he likes it. He likes the characters. There are a lot of things that he doesn't cover, which he covers in other movies. Like he doesn't talk about special effects. He doesn't talk about the direction. He doesn't talk about music. He doesn't talk about any of the technical aspects. He is literally just defending the characters because that's what makes the movie. If it didn't have those characters or those people playing those characters, it would not be the memorable movie that we are talking about right now. So as much as I love his passion, I would have liked to have seen him use a little bit more of the film's winning qualities in his debate rather than just the characters.
Yeah, I think that's fair. With Ebert, you know what? I want to give him a little extra points because he stated things I had on my notes, but at the same time, it wouldn't be fair. Everything that he said, he spoke from emotion, where the audio doesn't match the video. His written review and his rating doesn't match the amount of doesn't match the amount of passion he had of hate towards this movie on screen. So this is where it really contradicts and steers me away from his criticism here because he was a half a star away from 3 stars and he gave it thumbs down. And he was just sitting there just bashing this movie, treating it like it was the worst movie in the world by cherry picking a lot of these negatives that really didn't matter because this isn't the movie that really it thought that it wanted to be. It wasn't Roger's movie. And that's where I really strongly disagree with his viewpoint on it. So, because I think it's 100% inaccurate. And I wish I was giving Gene Siskel a review on this one because that one I would give a solid 3 stars to. But I have to give a solid 1 star to Mr. Ebert on this one.
You know what it feels like? It feels like he is so excited to talk about Color Purple next that in his mind, he thinks he's just going to rush through this one. I don't think he was expecting Gene to debate him over his love for this movie. It really felt like he was just trying to rush through it so they could get to Color Purple because they had a lot to say about Color Purple. And then Gene's just like, whoa, wait, you're wrong. You missed the boat on this one. I'm like, yes.
Well, I think that was on Roger's top 10 for that year too. So, I mean, he was excited about this movie. I mean, Oprah was in it. I know they were tight, but I'm not going to be that negative. That's for a completely different episode.
Right. Well, I love this movie. I love this conversation. And yeah, I didn't love Roger's critique of it, but to each his own, art's subjective. I just think that Enemy Mine, I'm not saying it's a lost gem of the 80s. I think this is one that doesn't get as much attention because it's not on streaming. Like, we hear so many good movies talked about lately that are just available on Tubi or Prime or something that's free that someone can just say, what is this? And then they discover it. You have to look for a movie. So you really have to convince people that it's worth renting, that it's worth looking for. And that's what we're doing right now. Go rent it. Go rent it on Prime or go rent it on YouTube. It's on all of the things. It's $4 and it's worth it. It's absolutely worth it.
It's one of those that will be in your head way after it's done. So to me, this one just screamed rewatch. It's one of those that now, after all these years, I need to see it every year because it's just a beautiful film.
Absolutely. So next week, we are going to be covering another beautiful film. Justin has decided to bring John Carpenter's Vampires, starring James Woods, to the show. And I'm actually really excited for this one because I haven't seen it since the theater. And I can tell you right now, I didn't hate it, but I don't know. Sometimes time heals wounds and sometimes it opens them up. So we'll see what it is. I got the Blu-ray on my shelf. I got it just for this episode, and I can't wait to watch it and talk about it next week.
I mean, if you really want to know my thoughts on it, you can take a look at our, I think, Oscar episode where I gave my true feelings of this movie. So I can't wait for this conversation.
That's right. I mean, once we get to this, remember, we had the If We Chose the Winners episode where they were talking about who they thought should have been nominated for the Oscars of that year. And Gene picked James Woods for John Carpenter's Vampires for Best Actor. So yeah, that'll definitely, I'm sure, fuel the conversation about this movie.
Can't wait for that one.
Everyone, thank you for watching, listening. Please do us a favor. Jump onto YouTube or your favorite podcatcher. Give us 5 stars, like, rate, review, share, tell your friends about it. And keep sending in the suggestions. We got another suggestion on YouTube today about cartoons episodes that Siskel and Ebert reviewed. So that's just one more to add to the list of listener requests. We can't wait to jump onto these episodes. Please follow me, Antonio, on my website, thecultworthy.com, and you can check Justin out
at themoviewire.com.
It's been a great episode. We'll see you next week.